Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, members. Welcome back after a delicious lunch. I know the post-lunch sessions are, very challenging both for the speaker and the participants. Now we will be having our next technical session, which is compliance with audit documentation. To handle this session, we have CA Abdul Majid sir with us. So I request the Treasurer of Bangalore branch to escort the speaker onto the dais and hand them over the floral bouquet. I would like to take the privilege in introducing C. Abdul Majid sir, who is the senior partner in PricewaterhouseCoopers Chartered Accountants LLP, which is based out of Bangalore and has over 30 years of professional experience. Prior joining to the Indian firm, he was part of PwC Middle East firms for 6 years and has worked mainly in the assurance line of services, and he was part of many large multinational and complex engagements. He has served the clients in different industries from manufacturing, automobile, IT, BPO, retail, insurance, banking, construction, telecom, oil, gas, etc. He is currently focused on retail, manufacturing, banking and NBFC clients over past 10 years. He has exposure to different GAAP, US GAAP, IFRS, etc. and gas, US gas, PCOB standards and ISA apart from Indian GAAP and gas. C. Abdul is a commerce graduate and a fellow member of Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. With this brief introduction, I welcome you again, sir, and I wouldn't like to come between you and the participants, sir. Over to you.
Good afternoon. I think very difficult to handle the session after lunch. I'll try my best to make it interesting. Let's see, I think. What I'll try to do is that maybe I think 30 or 40 minutes I'll cover the content and the essence of it, and maybe I think if you have any question answers, I think when you look at the audit documentations, when you start thinking through, you just need to think through in 2 layers. One at firm level, the quality standard, then at the engagement level. I think if you really look at our profession depends upon 2 fundamental, foundation stone, I can say. One is the healthy skepticism. Second is the judgment. If you take out these 2, I think there's nothing in our profession, frankly. And both are challenged today by the regulators and stakeholders at large. Why I'm saying is that because ultimately I'm going to link this documentation to this one. How you exercise skepticism in the audit and how you carry out your judgments. Because today I think if you look at financial statement audit, whether I should say fortunately and unfortunately, a lot more judgments are required. When I was doing an article, it was historical cost. Not much judgment required, but today it's all fair value. Half of the balance sheet or maybe 3/4 of your balance sheet is a fair value. Very difficult to audit. A lot more judgments are involved today. And judgment doesn't come basically based on, it comes through experience. The mastering the judgment is very important. So I think both judgment and skepticism is ultimately linked to a foundation. And every regulator requires to demonstrate this today in the files. It was very difficult. One of the biggest challenges I see today, when the regulator comes to review your file, they have the information in hindsight. They come and review, let's say for example in October or March 2022. Obviously October 2022 they have much more information. It's very difficult for us to say that how you overcome unless you really have a robust documentation or thought process. One golden rule is that basically more the judgment you do, more documentation is required. If you are doing judgment a lot, because judgments are required, like for example, the simple thing, how you set your materiality, how you do the risk assessment. So these are the judgment areas, right? I think there's no one right or wrong answer. So the more judgments are involved, the more documentation is required. And more complex matter, once again you have more documentation. So in that context, I think the whole objective is one, the practicing unit, whichever I think you are going to be a reviewer, whether how the practicing unit has ensured compliance with these standards at firm level, at the engagement level. That's the overall objective, what you have in going to do that. And obviously at the engagement level, you will be going to focus more on the financial level. So firm level, it's all ISQC 1. Now, old ISQC, I think then there's a new ISQC which is going to come through. Although I'm not going to talk about much in that, but nevertheless, I think we'll cover a few critical aspects in there. And then I think from there, if you have any question answer, I'll take it through. One golden rule, once again, like I said, more judgment, more documentation. If you don't document, it's assumed that you're not done the work. Simple. You can't say that, look, I'll pull my email, I'll pull something else. It's not accepted. Anything which is outside your audit file, because audit file is subject to archival rules. Once you archive a file, any documentation anyone adds, it's a criminal offense. That's how the regulators are looking at it, if you add any documentation later on. So that means, I think, if you are not done the work in your audit files, fairly assume that you are not. If you're not documented, you're not done the work. I think that's very, very important. So that's how things are changing. And it is our responsibility to prepare the audit documentation and keep in our files to how you are concluded. And your documentation, see, often people tend to tell me that, look, I think audit documentation is vain. I keep saying that audit documentation enhances the quality. When you do the audit, often I have seen that when you do the audit, when you start documenting, you realize that you missed something. So that means audit documentation really enhances the quality in a big way. I think many people don't understand that. So when you have audit documentation, what you're looking for is evidences. So there are audit documentation at engagement level or firm level. You are looking for evidences and basis which you are concluding. Because we are not giving absolute assurance in audit. We don't only give reasonable assurance. Right? What I check, basis which I keep. And then once again, from documentation you can conclude that whether the practicing unit has followed all these standards, both at the firm level, ISQC quality standard, and the engagement level standards. That is the overall objective, why you prepare the documentation. At the practice unit level, when you look at ISQC 1, I think now most of the regulators around the world, right, in US, UK, Japan, Korea, India, everywhere you look at it, they are focusing more not at engagement level. Engagement level they are coming later, first they are looking at the firm level. How do you build the quality culture in your firm level? That is the key aspect. So now for that, I think there is a standard, ISQC 1 standard, which talks about in different layers what you need to be doing. For example, at leadership level, engagement acceptance level, human capital level, engagement performance, right? So they want to look at in terms of how you really conduct your business to enhance the quality. And that's what we lay down in the ISQC 1 framework. As a peer reviewer, when you go back, I think you have the checklist, 2 checklists generally you have, 2 or 3 checklists you have. 1 checklist at firm level. You ask the firm, the practicing unit to fill. And they'll obviously fill that checklist. And the practicing unit has to keep documentation. And I'll come back to it. For example, leadership. What is the tone at the top? How they push the quality agenda to the practice? Through their communication, through their training, through their various policies. I think, that will help you. Basically, how the leadership cascade the quality messages. And how do we accept the engagement? See, today I think the most difficult part in the audit is engagement acceptance. With 30 years of our audit experience, I can tell you one thing. As an auditor, I think we need to distinguish between 2 things very clearly. Governance risk and audit risk. Often I see people they mix both the risks. If there is a governance risk, no matter what audit you do, you will fail. Because you are only doing reasonable assurance. So at acceptance level, at engagement acceptance level, whether the practice unit is really making that distinction clearly. Because you can't say that I will not take the audit because there's business risk. There's no business without any risk. You will have that risk, you have to deal with that risk. In my experience, I have seen that if you have a governance risk, it's impossible for you to do any reasonable audit. So at acceptance level, what sort of policy and procedures the practice unit has to accept the engagement? Different kind of engagement now. Right now we are talking about historical cost or financial statement audit. You have non-audit assurance engagement also. Same. It applies to the same standard. So engagement level acceptance. So I think if you look at then third is human capital. See what is critical in human capital? One, resources. Second, training. Third, how you really compensate people for the quality work and the growth aspect. That's what is required in the human capital from that perspective. Engagement team is so critical today. Getting the engagement team right. I've historically seen when I go for my own reviews, a lot of reviews are internationally also. Engagement team, compiling the engagement team itself is a very, very critical task. For example, if you are doing highly complex engagements or or company or the industries which are highly regulated like bank, NBFC, insurance, you require a different skill set. The practicing unit, how they compile the engagement team itself, do they have relevant experience, what sort of policy they have. That all comes in terms of, both hardware, software, infrastructure, personnel. Then it talks about HR recruitment policy. What's your policy? What's your base policy? How do you take that? How do you ensure compliance with CPs? The required training. What sort of operating checklist you use? Whether you're using software or an audit file electronically or paper file. What sort of standard operating checklist you have to ensure that ultimately aim is to enhance quality. Then manual and guidance. What sort of guidance you give? Because most of the auditing standards are principle based. For example, if you look at US auditing standards are rule based. To a certain extent they're rule based. But international auditing standards or even Indian auditing standards are a lot more is judgment there. There's no black and white. Right? There are broad guidance. As a firm, how they ensure what sort of operating guidelines they give to kind of implement those broad standards. For that you'll have audit methodology tools. Every firm has their own audit methodology tools. Right from the planning, execution, completion. I think you look at that. Then you look at what sort of research material you have. Because that's also very important because things are changing. How do you ensure in a complex area what sort of research you carry? How do you cascade the knowledge? And how you make sure that the people understand and then they implement in the audit. And what sort of review mechanism you have. So all of this are basically covered as part of human capital in the ISCC 1, which I spoke about, apart from leadership and acceptance and engagement, which I spoke about. And then, obviously, what sort of process the practice unit has put to comply, because just having policy is not sufficient. How do you enforce that and how do you monitor that those have been implemented? Ethical approach, which is extremely important in our profession. How do you once again ensure that ethical standards are complied at the firm level, at the engagement level, in the spirit? So that's very, very important. Then you have, obviously, I think, your engagement letters and what sort of templates you use for audit reports and how do you ensure that, I think, all the standards are complied with. It all comes at the firm level because every firm has its own methodologies. For example, it's highly desirable to have consultation policies because, you have to have critical areas, not one partner, two partner or three partner concur on certain things, right? So what sort of consultation policy you have? Mandatory consultation, whether it could be difficult gas, difficult gap. I think that's, once again, it comes at the firm level. And forming the opinion, what sort of templates you have, how do you ensure that I think these templates are compliant with standards. So I think these documents will help a peer reviewer. At a firm level, you get a fair understanding that the practice unit has a process. Leadership, acceptance continuous, human capital, engagement performance, right? And documentation and wrap-up policies are around that. I think that's how you get comfort. Once you look at it, and if they don't have, then you start looking at its deficiency. That's very, very important from that standpoint. And then if you look at, when you look at recruitment process, so you fairly look at in terms of interview process itself. How do you ensure that you are taking people who are competent? What sort of technical, test you conduct? What sort of interview you conduct? How do you ensure that I think the people who are taking are adequate? Just not because somebody passes a particular examination, he or she will not become competent. Obviously, I think they lack experience. But in interview, then where you put them, I think that's very important. How do you do the background checks? Because background check of employees are very, very critical in our profession. And the technical knowledge assessment. When I'm saying technical knowledge, it's essentially, it could be generally accepted accounting principle, whether it's an Indian GAAP, Ind AS, US GAAP, IFRS, whatever I think you are interviewing that person for. And then obviously these standards, auditing standards. Then of course the law and regulations. like an Indian context, firm act, company that direct tax, indirect tax, So you take interview of the person around all this technical, and you assess whether the person is capable of for that position. If you are taking for associate, the degree is slightly high, less. If you are taking for manager, it will be very high. So that's sort of, I think, technical assessment. And the past experience also. How do you consider past experience? Suppose if I want to have a team for the banking audit, obviously I can't take someone who has never done the bank and give the complex areas to them. Then your appointment formalities. And how do you, do the training of people. So broadly you just cover. So why are you doing that? Just to ensure that the firm has a process in place to enhance the quality. I think that's where you look at as part of the ISTC one, through a documentation. When you go for a review, I think you ask for all the documentation at each of the component. Leadership, you ask for all the communication. Accept and continuous, you say, okay, give me the policy. How do you accept the client? For example, there are certain firms where I've seen that they don't want to do audit of particular industry. Gambling they don't want to do because they said that we are not very familiar with this industry. Some firms I've seen, they said we don't want to do construction companies or cash is involved. Whatever it may be, I think it's depend upon that. I think you get at leadership level. So similarly, I think at HR level, all of those things you inquire, you understand the process, and you look for evidences. You look at the technical assessment form. You give the sample. Okay, tell me last 6 months whatever you hired. Can you tell me how many people you hired? Who conducted the interview? Where is the interview form filled? And what sort of technical assessment you have done? And the interviewer, whether he has recommended that person for the, to take that person into it. So you look at all the documentation. So it's very critical. You can't just have it that you've done. You need to insist for the documentation. It depends upon, I think, some firms have a very robust documentation process. Some are getting into it. But mostly, I think there has to be documentation to kind of help you to say that, okay, you have seen the evidences. Now the internal training programs are so critical because things are changing so fast. Every day you look at it, whether it's an RBI circular, SEBI circular, So I think how do you update this to the practice? You can't conduct training daily, right? You can conduct offline training, you can conduct online training, but there has to be continuous cascading of the information. For example, many firms have alerts which comes on a daily basis. If there are any changes, automatically the system triggers an alert that SEBI has changed related party transaction definition assessment. So that will help the practicing unit to understand that. If you don't have, then they will not be able to, because so many changes are happening. So how do you do that? So now I think training is just not once in 2 months, 3 months, or once in a year. It's a continuous basis training. So how it's been demonstrated? One classroom training, we have e-learn. And e-learn also, I think regulators are expecting that the e-learn, there has to be an assessment. How do you know that the person has done the e-learn unless until the past assessment? There has to be. So I think all of those things you look at part of your training programs and CPE training, of course, I think institute has prescribed. Then every firm has their own CPE training. For example, within our firm, I think a partner has to complete 80 hours of training in a year. No matter whether he does through institute, whether he does externally, internally, there has to training record. So that how do you ensure? And knowledge resource. Every firm has knowledge resources. What is knowledge resources? Nothing but they have all the tools and templates. For example, if you look at typical firms, they'll have companies like knowledge resources. All relevant companies like materials are there here. RBI knowledge resources, SEBI knowledge resources, various checklists you have. Whether it's a cargo checklist, Schedule 3 checklist, or maybe I think companies like checklist, or in standard checklist. So there's a database. That's why the practice you need to use this checklist. How do we share the knowledge, resources and share the knowledge? And continuous update which I have talked about. I think how do we ensure that this all knowledge database is updated properly? And of course attendance of your CP or seminar, webinars, whatever you have done, I think you need to have documentation for that. So that's also relevant because as a peer reviewer, you will get all this documentation and you will be happy that yes, there's enough evidences for the practice in it and we are comfortable. If not, then I think that becomes a red flag. That at the firm level I'm talking about all this. No hardware, if your firm is using this kind of hardware, software, the configuration. For example, I'll tell you, in the audit file you have electronic file. How you ensure that people don't change the date? Many firms have done that, nobody can change the date, that's it. You can't change. So how will you configure that? So that you want to look at the configuration. so that in the audit electronic documentation, somebody doesn't go back and change, tamper the dates. Software updation, if you have the software, if you have an updation, for example, many firms I've seen, they have banking library, insurance library, different industry library they have. Whenever there is a change in that, for example, if November 12th circular came from RBI, how do you make sure that this gets cascaded into your software? So there are updates which happen to the software. So you check that also, how changes have been done. Audit tools in electronic form, other tools you have, they are using tools. You want to understand the governance around that tool. If somebody is using the tool for data analytics, how do you know that the tool itself has a proper logic? What sort of system the firm practice unit has to look at that? You look at that. Then data storage and security, which is typical, and backup how you take, and connectivity. All of those things you look at, from some through inquiry, some through looking at the evidences, some through looking at the processes and documentation. And then attendance, of course, I think this is a very straightforward in terms of you look at it. And many firms have SOP and checklists, operating checklists, just to ensure that they comply. Because, for example, some companies have, some practicing unit have acceptance and continuous electronic form. What do they do is that they look at, before they accept an audit, first they want to understand the governance of the company, which industry the company is in, whether the industry is fine with us. Do we have adequate knowledge to test, to do the audit of that engagement? Once you're comfortable, then you look at the governance, then you decide whether you want to really accept that audit or you don't want to accept that audit. That's what you cover as part of that in operating procedures. Then there are standard formats, depend upon the practicing unit to practice unit. What it is, and from my experience I've seen is that more the complex the area, you tend to see standard formats. So that consistency of application is there. Otherwise the engagement team will start interpreting in their own way. Now, in terms of documentation, what's the basic thing one has to look at it? So, one is the clarity and understanding. If I were to just make it more practical, let's assume that I'm just looking at more now from the audit file. As I said, one golden rule is that basically more the complex, the more documentation expert. In the planning activity, when you look at typical planning and audit, there are only 3 phases in audit: the planning, the execution, and the completion, the wrap-up. In the planning activity, the more important thing where you want to make sure that the practice unit has documented properly. Of course, the acceptance and continuance will be there for that engagement. What sort of risks are coming from acceptance and continuance, and how the risks are mitigated. For example, if there is a risk of going concern when you're accepting the client, and how that risk is addressed in the audit. So there's a clear linkage. So that is called acceptance and continuance in the planning stage. The second very critical element in planning is independence. You document, are you really independent? Whether RBI, I think, has different requirement, IRDA has different requirement, Companies Act has different requirement around 44. How the practicing unit has done. If you have a complex independence matter, then you have to look for more documentation. If the firm has taken a complex independence and concluded that we are independent, there are judgment involved in independence, it's not so straightforward. So you look for more documentation in independence. That's the planning once again. The third critical element in the planning is materiality. There's no right or wrong rule for materiality. You might take on profit, you might take on loss, you might take on expenses, you might take on revenue, you might take on asset. So how do you make sure that, how do you set the materiality? And what rationale you have used? Because materiality, remember, if materiality is very high, you tend to do under audit. If materiality is low, you tend to do over audit. You don't want both to happen, right? So materiality is the third component in your planning. The fourth component in planning is your risk assessment. Although the auditing standard, if you look at it world over, they expect one risk to be there in audit file, which is the management override of control. You can't revert that risk. All over the world, at least regulators have now kind of in the same way that in audit file there has to be one risk, which is management override of control. Then you need to identify that risk and you need to say how the audit team has, whether it's a general entry testing, whatever testing they've done. Similarly, risk assessment, see, if you don't identify the risk area, then I think the chances that the audit will fail. Because more the risk area we are expect. These are very different because a lot of people confuse between CAM and risk. They are 2 different things. CAM is different, risk is different. So how do you do the risk assessment? So generally I've seen people default to management out of control. They don't go for other risks. Other risk area could be revenue, Others could be a related party in Indian context as in very risky proposition. Contingent liability could be risk area, right? Sometimes consolidation itself is a risk area. I think people don't. So how do you look at risk assessment there in the planning stage, right? So these are certain areas where I think you expect documentation to be more because there's more judgment involved there. Other important area in the planning is that fraud risk assessment, because that's one area where I think we all have to do more and more, right? So what sort of frauds will happen at each line item, revenue, expenses, assets, liabilities, stuff like that. Similarly, if you come back to execution phase, I'm talking about planning phase. In execution phase, for example, I think more complex area, intangible assets, very, very difficult to audit, once again, the carrying value. You will expect more documentation there, right? So like that, I think you have to look at, I think there's no one standard rule that you have to have this minimum documentation. Minimum is there, but it depends on how much you need to document on complexity and judgment. So some of the golden rules have been given is in terms of how clear the documentation is there. Whether an independent auditor who doesn't have any knowledge of that particular audit, he or she will understand. How do you ensure complete and accuracy, right? See, many frauds have happened. One basic check has not been done. What do you do before you select the sample? You will take a listing, you agree with the GS. If you don't do that, in my experience I've seen, where the management has given good list to you, where there are no fraud, and that list is not matching to GL, because there's another list which is all fraud and transaction. So this basic thing, if you don't do it, I think you'll be in trouble. I think many frauds have happened in this country, which I've seen, which I'm aware of it, where the basic thing is not done by the team, you've just not agreed the listing with the GL. So like how you ensure completeness, which is what pertains to the documentation, and the logical arrangement, the planning, execution, completion, and obviously how neat it is, how legible, because somebody has to read, safety or take care of. You have to have the date, who has prepared that documentation, who has reviewed the documentation, and what I think now with the electronic form you'll have timing also, because regulators are now pushing most of the audit firms to have electronic audit files, so that I think we get the time now, and summary and conclusion. That has to be clearly documented, whether you are comfortable in that area and your conclusion is positive, negative, or you're not happy, and how you deal with that. See, one area in the plan is that what is your strategy? I'm talking now all about engagement, because ISQC one I spoke about. In engagement, the most important thing is that if you don't do the planning right, often execution becomes a problem. So in the planning, what is required, apart from the area which I talked, what is your audit strategy? At each financial line item, how much you want to depend on, how much you want to rely on controls, which controls, IT controls or manual controls, then how much you want to do substantive control, testing, and how you want to control. It has to be very clearly articulated in audit files. That's expectation. For example, if I have cash in bank, what's my strategy for that? Revenue, what is my strategy for that? Right? So that has to be clearly articulated in documentation. I think that's what's audit plan, what audit plan you want to follow for each. And supervision. See, even the area, now I think what most of the practicing will do, a complex area, maybe there are 2 layers of reviews. See, a partner is not expected to review the entire audit file. Impossible to do that. Where the partner really focuses the risk areas, which have been identified. So, for that area, generally I think you expect more review to happen. Prepaid expenses, you don't have to really worry about that, right? I think. But if it's like say NPA, ECL provision. So once again, this whole great supervision depends upon the complexity and number of reviewers will differ, right? I think whether that's there or not. And how they ensure that who's accountable for that particular work paper. The person who prepares it, the person does first level review, the person does second level review. And then you got to retain this documentation for regulatory purposes, review purposes, and even for the future audits. Okay? And then conduct a quality review. I think obviously as at engagement level also you have the quality review 220. As a 220, I think the quality review partner goes through the files and external inspection. And in case of legal claims, I think what will save is only your documentation. Right? I think it's very difficult to defend yourself in the court if something goes wrong. And as I said, documentation can be, in terms of physical or cross-referencing. Once again, I think if you have the documentation, you expect the written reference properly. You have something in the hard copy, something in your soft copy, how to cross-reference that. It's all legible, because otherwise it's very difficult if a third person comes and starts looking at it. The whole objective is that experienced auditors, whether he or she can understand by looking at the documentation. And completeness of documentation also is very important. You know, how they complete, because the moment you finish the work, you complete the documentation. Even if you have something, you leave the coaching note, you complete the documentation. There should not be time back. Content of the documentation. And assembly, obviously you need to assemble all the documentation in 60 days. See, once you sign the report, the rule is that you can't add any new audit evidence once you sign the report. Assembly is nothing but I'll take all the papers from everywhere and put in the file. I am not supposed to add a new evidence to it. So that's assembly, because many times people tend to think that let me finish the audit, after 60 days I'll pull all the documentation. No, that's not that. That's ethically wrong. And retention of the file as per the Companies Act. And obviously, you need to clearly define which is the, because it's very, very important to understand. Incomplete documentation expose the practice unit, expose the firm also. So, which documents are not required to put in the file. For example, document if you have very rough documentation, you are not concluded. Such kind of documents are required. So that is something which the practice unit have the policies. And how that has been done as part of that. I think you look at that also as part of this documentation. I think some rough here, what I will talk about is that I think, just key messages here. There is something called NT, nature, timing and extent. Most of the standard around globe talk about this. What is the nature of my test? And extent of my test and my conclusion and the timing of it. So that's a golden rule I think one has to apply here. Couple of examples here that oral explanations will not stand test of your documentation, right? Compliance to auditing standards are very, very critical. There are certain standards you need to do, few things. For example, there is standard on confirmation. There is a standard on inventory verification, right? So how do you ensure compliance with those? Or there is standard on the expert involvement. How do you enter? Because many times I've seen, I think, where the documentation lack is there that you rely on expert, but you don't have the scope documented. Because the expert, because in audit today, I think there's not just audit. I think you have valuation team, you have forensic team, you have financial risk management team. Different teams are helping you. How do you ensure that I think the scope is properly documented and they have done the work, right? And if there is significant matter or key audit matter, or where the judgment is involved, as I said in the beginning, you need to have robust documentation on that. And if you depart from the auditing standard for some reason, there may be chances that your law says something through a standard says something. Then you depart that. Then for that, I think obviously you have more documentation. I'll give you a classic example, which goes around in our profession, I think. For example, CCPS. Under India's it's liability. Under Companies Act, it's not a liability, it's state capital. Some firms have taken a call that Companies Act is superior to India's. So they clearly bring out in the audit report that this is not in line with India's, but it's in accordance with the Companies Act. It's judgment the practice unit has taken, they clearly bring it out. So you need more documentation there for that actually. And then I think there's some of the things which I just don't repeat. What can, applying what can go wrong technique? See, the critical thing is the risk actually. When the risk isn't properly identified in your documentation and you're done end of work, in a normal sense. I think that's a critical thing. And if you look at Caro today, I know, because I worked in many countries, I never come across such kind of lengthy report in India what we have. Caro has many things which are kind of, assertion, whether it's a fixed asset, inventory, loans and advances, fraud, whether it's statutory payment. So for that, I think you look for, adequate work has been done. Obviously, you're not expecting someone to do 100%. See, they all do sample tests, but at least they understand the process. So the more, I think, reportable matters, you expect more, kind of documentation around that area because, otherwise you will not be able to say how our practicing unit. So Caro is one area, I think, where I've seen many firms have checklists and have a standard template how to document also. Just to have a consistency amongst the engagement team. So you can look for that. And of course the different checklists which are there because at minimum I've seen company, most of the practice unit having Companies Act checklist, accounting standard checklist, auditing standard checklist, FEMA checklist some companies have, some have that. Some have quality standard checklist just to ensure that the quality is being done. So I think depending upon that you can look from that engagement file. And there are certain critical things where you also need to understand is that, the basic documentation, whether they are in the file, they are very, very critical. Your engagement letter, your representation letter, all of those things. And, acceptance, which I talked about. And if you are a new audit, then how you communicate with the previous auditors, right? And now I think you're seeing, regulators have started a new thing, RBI expects to meet the practice unit. Then they will give a lot of their thought process, how do you document, how do you, and then client register, is nothing but client listing, audit programs. I think some of these things, draft audit report. So all of those things I think will only help you to say just that, I think if you go through that audit file, if they are there, it gives comfort to you in terms of saying that the practice unit has carried out the audit in accordance with these standards. And I think this is once again from your perspective, I think there are not that I think you'll just directly go. I think there is a practice unit consultant checklist. You have a lot of checklists around that. So you can fill as a peer reviewer, because then peer review board has done a good job in terms of helping the practice unit peer reviewers to both at the firm level, the engagement level, they have a detailed checklist. And that checklist is available. I think you need to fill the checklist. For example, I think you have a checklist on the independence, professional skills and standards, outside consultant if you are hiring, what sort of checklist you should have, staff supervision, office administration, and some of these things I think illustrative document also I think the peer review board has developed, engagement letter format, LOR format and all of those things. So you can use those checklists and the guidance note while you carry out your peer review, and that will kind of help you from that standpoint. And detail, I think once again, I think you see most of these things are available in your toolkit as a peer reviewer. You can use a checklist both at the firm level, at the engagement level, and carry out your review. And if there are any negative marks in the checklist when you fill in, that potentially might become a qualificatory matter for you at firm level or at the engagement level. For example, when you fill the checklist, suddenly you realize that I think the no training records are maintained. That becomes a red flag for you, because you are not able to see that training record, or you are not able to see how they comply with the independence. There is no policy for that. Then you might have a challenge that how consistently independence has been taken care of. So that might become at the firm level red flag, or an engagement letter. For example, you don't have the engagement letter itself in the file. That could be a red flag. Or LOR is not in the file, letter of opinion. That could be a red flag. Or you don't have the standard template for the audit reports. If everyone starts writing the audit report, it might differ. That's why most of the practice unit have a standard format based on, I think, ICI guidelines and all of those. So I think here also you have lots of checklists available for you. So you can use this checklist and then to complete that. So that's the whole thing. Office administration, because I just want to go through, because all of you know with office administration complies of all the admin activity. So for that also you have the checklist. You can use the checklist and fill the checklist. And see, there are certain things which obviously when you look at the audit documentation, one of the critical areas that many firms have policy that which corresponds to bring in the audit file, which should not bring in the file, because that's not really going to add any value. And obviously there are current audit file, the permanent audit file, that's concept. I think audit programs and follow-up work paper, follow-up is also very, very important. Auditor's appointment and monitoring of audit work. I think these are all, this is once again I think more administration side, I think, which I spoke about. The financial statement, I think this is where you really focus on that. Technical standards, if it's India's, how the practice unit has complied with the India's requirement, etc. And there also, once again, it's not that you need to just go through everything. You need to select which are the difficult India standards. See, whenever you look at as a peer reviewer, you need to look at which is a complex area. Because, for example, 115, 109, 107, right, 101. I think these are very complex standards. Or 112, 12, 113, complex standards. How they will be implemented? What sort of guidance is there, right? So that technical standards, I think, depends upon which if the entity is, let's say, in the financial services, 109 becomes very critical for that. The business model assessment, what they've done. So that I think you can focus there. List of certificates. See, once again, the one area of concern, I think, which not concern. Now I think there's no audit. You all know that limited review audit will come at a standard. But increasingly, the non-audit assurance agreements are becoming very, very. The list is increasing. SEBI wants some certificate, RBI wants some certificate, IDA wants some certificate, right? One of the area where I think practicing units struggle from my experience, what is an NAE? If some client comes to you, you give me this report. There are 3 conditions for an engagement to become NAE. Often many of the practicing units don't have robust guidance around that. So what are the 3 conditions? First condition is basically the criteria. What criteria I'm going to use to measure it, to audit? Criteria, audit evidences and conclusion. If that is not meeting, then it's not NAE. So obviously, client cannot insist, but unfortunately, some of the regulators have certificate requirement. I know that it's very difficult for an auditor to really, then you do back to back. For example, if a foreign nation is MD, an auditor has to certify the person is not lunatic or incompetent. I don't know how we can certify that, I don't know, on the earth. He will certify that he is not lunatic, then I'll say based on his certificate he is not lunatic. I don't know what value it will add, but it is there. So you need to look at something differently. So I think some of these things will become easily for you, how the practicing unit is organizing this. Audit, historical cost audit, limited review, NAE, what sort of guidance they have. And checklists, and this which I spoke about. And one, I think, highly encouraging trend you should push to the practicing unit is that they should complete the quality checklist at the end of each audit, which is not happening currently. People complete accounting standard checklist, companies act checklist, auditing standard, but there is a quality standard checklist also, which is very robust. If the engagement team fills a quality standard checklist, you yourself take care of. By and large, 90-95% you're okay. So that's also, I think, one of the good, practice which you can insist for it. If you are involving outside a consultant, then I think obviously list of registered consultant. How do you know that they're independent? How do you know that they're competent? As an auditor, I think the first thing you do is that are they competent? If you're involving someone for valuation, first thing you do, competent. Even if you do joint audit today, the requirement is that as an auditor, you need to assess the competence of joint auditor, although it's not in our framework, but you document that, yes, they are safe firm, so many years they are there, so you all document that. So I think list of outside consultant, obviously you look for more, from that perspective. And then make sure that you are comfortable, and the practicing unit is comfortable using them, and they're expert and they're independent, and they are pretty objectivity, they have objectivity in carrying out their work. So I think must contain sufficient information to enable experienced auditors. It's very, very high level, but nothing like, whatever you document. And without any previous audit connection, if somebody comes to the audit file who has knowledge of audit, he or she is able to understand what you have done, that means you have, understood, you have fairly, complied with documents and standards. And how did you reach the conclusion? I think that's probably I want to just cover in that. I think if you have any Q&A or something, I'm more than happy to take it. So that's any questions you have or anything for that matter, 10-15 minutes, we can do that. But there was a lot of practical questions, whether it's a firm level, whether it's engagement level. No, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the session and showing us the light on the documentation aspects, what we need to maintain. On behalf of Bangalore branch of SIRC, I would like to thank you for taking this session and making yourself available for this session. And thank you, sir. Thank you once again. I request Treasurer of Bangalore branch to hand over a memento as a token of gratitude to our speaker.